Hello, welcome back to Possibilities with Monique DeMeo. I have a special guest today, Jen Faraday in the house. Hi,
Hello.
Jen.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here, Monique.
It is so much fun to have you. Jen is one of my faves, my BFFs, my go-to women. Smart, beautiful, internally and externally. She has so much to share with us. And in my book, she has lead off on internal narratives and what that does to our stories for ourselves, for others, etc. Jen, I just want to throw it over to you to say, is the word internal narrative or the expression internal narrative something new?
I guess actually it is unique, like you are unique. Haven't heard it that way, internal narratives, but certainly that idea of the stories you tell yourself and the self talk that you might have versus maybe an external one is certainly something I've thought about a lot and has been really something that has impressed upon my life in different ways. So, but I love how you put it, internal narratives. I think that's a beautiful way to position it.
Tell us about your story. You're one of the most highly educated and diplomaed and trained people that I know. I have a tremendous amount of respect for the fact that you're a lifelong learner
Lifelong student.
and you lifelong learner, lifelong student, lifelong everything, right? That makes you interesting because you have so much to say and share. Yeah, absolutely. So you tell a story about, you coming to kind of grasp this whole internal narrative thing. Can you share that with the audience here for those of them who have not read the book, which most of them will not have?
So, I grew up loving family. My parents were immigrants coming over from the Philippines. And I had a very, very happy, wonderful childhood. But as with many immigrants, there were expectations from my culture and from my parents as immigrants on kind of what it meant to be successful, what they expected from us. And so that shaped much of my idea of and my choices later on. And so you'll see in the book that, there were times where those choices almost dominated and maybe led me down maybe a path I a little off the path that I wanted to be on. And then there were times where I reined it back in and was able to kind of look at it and say, okay, despite these kind of expectations that might be put on me internally, going back to that internal narrative, what do I want to actually choose and decide upon? So it's always this kind of push pull in many ways. In the book, we talk about it ping ponging a bit of, when some of those expectations that you might have on you from childhood, from parents, from society, even that we can talk about even more, when that should kind of play into it, and when you want to maybe use an internal compass of your own.
Yeah, tell us. You were talking about not giving yourself grace when you had moments of pivot, and I think you had some of the smartest pivots of anybody I know. But I'd like you to kind of unpack that for the audience and talk about, where you were and the pivot you made, and then the other pivot you made, and then ultimately where you found yourself in hindsight, realizing that those pivots really served you.
Yeah, it's so easy in retrospect. In retrospect, you see the path, but sometimes along the way you don't. So if we're specifically talking about career, for example, I had a very non-linear journey, right? So I graduated, not really unsure what I wanted to do. Took a quick job through corporate recruiting and advertising because of the prestige of it. Working in in New York City in an agency at the time in the early '90s. So I took it, and it was a great first job. But I quickly realized that this was not for me, and that I took it for again the prestige. I ended up starting a career for about 10 years in education, which I loved. And that was a decision from that internal narrative, right? I really thought about what I wanted to do, and I really loved education and teaching. And so I followed my kind of passion and my interest towards that. Then, as career, as life happens, the different stages, I had children, and for many different reasons, I was taking a look at that career choice and realized that maybe I was coming to the end of that, and that I wanted to do something else, and I wasn't sure what to do. I was thinking at the time that I was always interested in entrepreneurship, and at the time I started doing my own family finances, and I thought, oh, maybe if there's a career in finances that I would want to pursue. And I ended up doing a really 180 and getting my CFP and pursuing finances.
Which, by the way, for those of you listening, is not a small feat. Okay. It is a huge, huge commitment and also very difficult.
Yeah, and very difficult because I also had never had any experience in finances. My major, no economics, no any kind of finances growing up. But that's why I wanted to do it, actually. I was very interested in the fact that as a female and as someone who was so educated, that I had this knowledge was never taught to me, but it was so important for women to know this. And so that was kind of my intuition, my passion, going for the right, quote unquote, right reasons for going into that and making that change. But once I got my CFP, the reasons why I entered it, kind of like to teach women, kind of combine that kind of my old career in education, teaching, with this passion now I had about finances and teaching women. That's what I wanted to do with my CFP, but I ended up kind of in a more traditional wealth management role on planning and in portfolio management. And while I don't regret it, it was not why I made that decision in the first place. And I was kind of, I wouldn't say stuck there, but I stayed there for a while. And it was like putting on a sweater that just didn't fit right, but because I didn't think of that I could take it off, to be honest. We can get into why, but I felt like I had to stay there because, and you said, because the CFP was so difficult, and I went and I made that change. Like, could I really make another change? Like, there was a lot of questions about whether I could really pivot off of that career path. Where I am now is I do work for a wealth management firm, but in a different type of role, and I can bring in a lot of the other things that I was interested in the past. So I have been able to craft like a really nice position and role for myself, but it took me a long time to get there. And I would like to say, before we get maybe to other things, that some of this is less too about the circumstances, about whether I'm wealth management, whether I'm in teaching, whether I'm pivoting into what or other, and more about what you're saying to yourself in that. That is so important. Like just the stories you tell yourself while you're in wherever you are in your journey. So I think, whether or not I stay here or not, I think there was a long time in that career where I was just almost beating myself up and had just a lot of self-doubt around my choices. And that's the piece that I hope that, through your book and through these interviews that you're having, people get a little bit from is how you're talking to yourself in those choices and in the decisions that you're making.
Unpack that a little bit for us, because it's, people on the surface, people look at you and you have an Ivy League education, you have a CFP, you're a certified coach, you've got all of these things that are now operationalized and giving you such joy because you've been able to craft this role that does all of this wonderful, all of your skills and all of your passions in one, right? But that journey wasn't always straight, and it certainly wasn't without its bumps. What is the kind of self-talk that you're referring to that may have been present for you and that others?
Well, again, at the time, I felt like I was stuck, and you're never really stuck, right? And I think that I think is would be important, because you always have choices and you always have learning, right? And you always have the ability to see further, right? So I think this was only one step in my journey, right? And
Yeah, no, I want to hear more about these pivots that you had in the moments where that sweater not fitting. I want to understand how you got that gooey feeling of this sweater is not fitting. How did that happen for you? You had a moment.
well, I kind of knew the minute I made the choice and I was in it, right? This is just the one particular, right? When I was maybe doing some things in my role that weren't this that were taking up more of my day to day than I thought they would. I just knew I wasn't enjoying myself. It wasn't what I was where my strengths were. And instead of making the change, or at least, well, I either could have made the change quicker, or I could have said to myself, and this is talking about internal versus like circumstances, could have changed my circumstances quicker and say, okay, this is not working for me. I need to do something else. Or I could, when I made the choice to stay longer, I could have talked to myself differently about why the sweater isn't fitting, but I'm staying because X, Y, and Z. This gives me a stepping stone for later, because I'll have great experience from this, or because I want to learn this while I'm here. I know that I'm going to be able to learn something else to be able to take to me next. And I didn't have that intentional narrative.
That conversation with yourself. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I felt very stuck in that situation. Yeah. So I feel like in many ways, you don't necessarily have to make those changes right away. And we did, again, in the book, we talk about how it can unfold in its time, and, that I don't regret any of those decisions. But I do wish I did. If I made some of those decisions, I talked to myself differently about them, and I offered myself just a little bit more grace.
Isn't that funny? So we talk to ourselves with this notion of scarcity, I think often. And that's a pretty known world. It's like you're not enough of something. You're not doing enough, you aren't enough, whether that's rich, thin, smart, whatever the not enough is, where we self-sabotage all the time. And I talk about in the book how you talk to yourself is physiologically important because it has these, I mean, you could make yourself sick as an example, right? You could break out into hives if you're talk to yourself negatively enough. Yeah, I'm sick. Boo, hives come out, like but all kidding aside, the mind body connection is super, 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 super important and real. So you're talking to, let's say, a younger generation of women who are not giving themselves grace and they're beating themselves up and they're in these jobs that they're not happy, or they're in a life circumstance that they're not happy with, and they're beating themselves up about the circumstance. What do you say about that? What can that internal narrative shift to being?
I mean, there's so many different things you can say to yourself. I think the first thing is to just be aware. Okay, so you can't access a new thought or a new narrative until you realize that you have an existing one. A lot of times we believe it just is, or this is the way it is, or we started the conversation talking about childhood and how we get some of these from society, and we're taking these narratives as given, as beliefs, as right or wrong, but they're not. They're just another story that we end up taking in and believing without realizing that there's always a choice in that. So I think sometimes we think things are facts, but they're actually thoughts and narratives and stories, right? So I think the first thing before you try to get out of it or change it or even change your circumstances, to really recognize what you're telling yourself and what is actually a real circumstance versus a thought or a story.
That's so powerful. And it's funny, we can convince ourselves of pretty much anything, can't we?
Yeah. So again, going back to the choice I was talking about with the first, the first pivot into wealth management, it was less about the actual job. It was more all the stories I was telling myself of that circumstance in many respects.
So tell us the stories that you were telling yourself so that people can kind of wrap their brain around the reality.
I wasn't good at it, or I was even just the notion that I was stuck, right? Or I had to stay there. I mean, very few things are facts if you really think about it. But going back to parental beliefs, for example, part of that was this sense of, oh my gosh, if I switch again, you know, what are people going to think? My parents came over to this country with one career path. They're doctors, they were staying doctors. I don't even know if they enjoyed being doctors. I think they did. But even if they didn't, I don't think they would ever change, because that's not what you did. So even this notion of being able to pivot and change was something that for many years I thought was something you're not supposed to do. So when I found myself in my first job after when I made the switch to wealth management, not quite liking what I was doing as much, the first story I told myself was like, oh gosh, I can't even, just suck it up, because, you can't switch again. You've made so many changes. Instead of thinking, what about this don't I like? Are there ways that I could, make it better? My initial reaction was more of kind of shame, and it doesn't matter. I have to, kind of put my head down and stay here because this is the choice I made.
It's interesting, the internal and the external. We talked about this before, that they're so intertwined. And you made reference to what are people going to think? And now you talk about in the book, which was I just loved it so much, that now you're not as concerned and you don't really care what people think. And that has been liberating for you. I do want to unpack that a little bit. I want to go back to, what do people think and how do we react to it and how does this become our story? So, the highly educated, upper middle class suburbanite that you were, you talk about being a little bit of a chameleon and how that was a helpful thing because it allowed you to do certain things. And then it was a not so helpful thing because it prevented you from owning your story. Can you unpack that a little bit? Because I thought that was so interesting.
Oh, thanks. It's hard because, yeah, I do find that it's a strength of mine, actually. I can pivot very quickly. I can kind of read a room and kind of fit in, you know, and so that is a good strength. And I happen to be good at many things that society feels like you need for success, like traditional success. I was good at school, I was good I got good grades. I was kind of had a friendly demeanor, so I was able to kind of be social when I needed to be, and kind of adapt to different environments pretty easily. And so that's all great, right? But then I got validated for that. And so you receive external validation for those things, and then you learn that you need to keep doing that. And so that brings you further and further. I shouldn't say always, but in my case, it kind of brought me further and further away from what I really wanted, because I was good at things and I would get a promotion or I would get a good grade. And so I would say, oh, well, then I have to keep doing that, and without saying, wait a minute, do I even like that? Is that actually even what I want to do? And I've seen this a lot, actually, with even clients that I've coached before, where you ask them a simple question like, well, what do you like? And they don't know. And then you can start with even a simple thing like, well, what kind of flowers do you like? Or what kind of what is your style? And they some of them don't know because they've just been taught, oh, I'm supposed to like, Monique and I bought our houses around the same time, I think. And at the time, French country was really in, right? And so I felt like because I've seen it so much, and I just kind of thought that that's how I should decorate my home. And I remember thinking, God, I really don't actually even like this, but my whole entire family room was French country for a bit. And so that's not quite a good example, though, because it wasn't validated necessarily by that. But with the grades and with all of the career choices, I think sometimes that happened where you sometimes I not always, but I have examples of where I almost lost myself because I was following a journey where I just happened to be good at something, or, received praise somehow externally, that I didn't pause and think, wait, is that really what I want to do? Because there's a difference between what you want to do versus what you're good at.
Oh my God, that was my question. I think we need to totally unpack that because you're good at a lot of things. So being validated for that friendly demeanor and you're so chill and she's so nice and she's so warm and oh my God. Okay, so you can't be, you can't be any other way?
Right, exactly. Because then people are like, wait, that's not quite how, And listen, it's hard. I think also as women, it's not just, I think a lot of women are conditioned to be that way, right? To adapt and to, take care of people in the room, not ruffle feathers. So there's a lot of conditioning that we receive and messaging that we receive as women. I think we receive a lot of that conditioning too as immigrants. So that is definitely something that was a part of my story. But it's also, and this is also important. So when you had mentioned in kind of your intro, that intersection between internal and external narratives, because we also don't want to reject that piece of you that has learned that, So I think you reach a point where you have to ask yourself, what do I want to incorporate in? It's that intentionality of the narrative and the story you're telling yourself. So let's take the grades, for example. I had this expectation to be good at school, right? That you had to kind of get good grades and put school and education first. I happened to be able to do that, and then it becomes, do I want to do that versus rejecting that altogether just because it happened to have come from an external conditioning. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. I mean, you're trying to get the point across that just because it was given to you doesn't mean you need to accept it. But where I want to go and unpack and go deeper with you is the idea that you're aware. When do you become aware that really you're telling yourself a story or that you're not stuck with this thing that was given to you because you're an Asian American immigrant, for instance? It's the idea of education first, get good grades, go to a good school, get a good job, and so on, and everything else will happen from there. Well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but just the fact that you went to a great school, you got good grades, you had a great career in multiple times, but let's just say that initially you went to that prestigious choice. Did you have to stay to the right? You made a left and then you made a right, and but whatever. But the awareness of, are you stuck on that road? When did that come? Because you're young and like I don't even know that I had the vocabulary or the awareness to know that I wasn't being intentional when I made the right or the left. I just made the right. I didn't know from that.
I think I think everyone has the capacity to know if they ask themselves and are quiet with it. So listen, here's the thing. It's not always a problem. Right? I mean, I think there is something to, and I don't take this the wrong way, but the adage, ignorance is bliss. I mean, sometimes if you're kind of going along and you're liking the path you're on, I mean, I think you don't necessarily have to go deep with everything, I think when something's off. If you take the time to get quiet and listen to it.
You know when something's off. I think you're right about that. But you may not know what is off. How do you know it's off? Something doesn't sit well, you don't feel well, your stomach bothers you. Like what are we telling these women that are listening to this podcast? You follow your instinct? You know when something's off, or tell them to quiet the noise and sit and be? Like what is if you're coaching the listeners of this podcast and they're not really where they want to be, but they don't know where to start.
Yeah, I mean it's hard. It really depends on the situation, but I think it's really again going back to the story you're telling yourself. So, you know, if somebody's coming to me and with a question about their career, it's really unpacking, okay, what are the thoughts you're having about it? And really understanding what, from there, eventually and getting, eventually you have to know what you have to define what you want too. Because otherwise you can't get it's like a GPS in a car, right? At some point you have to program in where you want to go. So you do need clarity on that. But if you don't have the full like picture of where you want to go, like again using the GPS analogy, you can at least look around where you are in your car, your butt, and say, okay, is this where I want to be? Right? So you might again not be able to program, oh, I want to be here, but you can look around and be like, okay, this is not it. And then start programming in some things along the way at least. So I think that analogy does work a bit too for yourself, right? Is to again, if you don't have that clear destination, what are the clues that at least will take you to the next step?
Or what is it about where you are that you don't like? I don't like this neighborhood, to use the GPS analogy. I'm in a neighborhood that doesn't feel right to me. I worked with a guy that used to say, "Don't let the GPS run your life."
Hmm.
And,
Interesting.
and yeah, it's really interesting for me, particularly because, and when the kids started to learn how to drive, I would say, get around town, get around the area without the GPS. Just start to learn how to navigate for yourself. So you have external clues and you have street names and you have landmarks, because otherwise you check your brain at the door. And so, this idea of life by default versus design is something that I talk about a lot. And it's that idea that if you did check your brain at the door and let the GPS take over, you may end up not even noticing what's around you. And you're saying you may not know your destination, ergo, you don't program it into the GPS, but you kind of know if you pick up your head and you think about it, what neighborhoods you're in and whether or not you think you're lost.
Yeah, exactly. You're still somewhere. Right? So start there. Start where you are. What do you like about what your current situation?
With all of the learning that you've had over your years, and now, being a smarter, more mature Jen, how has that impacted the way you've parented your daughters versus the way you might have been parented?
That's a great question. I really try is the operative word because we're not perfect as parents, but I really try with my daughters and my son to try not to have expectations of them and really allow them to have their own journey. Because going back to what we're talking about, I think, and listen, I had wonderful parents, and so certainly not to blame anything on them, but there were strong expectations of how what was expected of me, what success meant, and it's sometimes again, as we mentioned throughout this whole conversation, it factored into some of my decision making. And I would love them to be free of that so they could listen more to that true internal compass. And so, how does it show up? It shows up a lot of times just listening instead of offering advice that's not solicited. It shows up by asking them, "Do you want advice now, in my opinion, or do you want me to just listen and hear you out?" A lot of it is, coaching in some respects. It's active listening and just kind of mirroring what their own brain is kind of saying and guiding them in that way versus actually saying you should do this, this, and this.
Well, isn't that sort of like giving them the answers versus letting them figure it out without the GPS?
It's really just asking good questions in many respects, which is what a good parent and a good coach actually does.
Have you been surprised by the answers that you get when you ask the questions?
No, actually. um, no, not yet. But again, I really just trying them to allow them to be their own person and have their own journey. I think was is where I want to be as a parent, is really just be there for them, support, but not as their GPS.
I love this GPS analogy. This is going to go, we got to do a master class on GPS in your life, man. This is it. Do you think our daughters have a different or show up with a different internal narrative than we might have at their age? Now, understanding our daughters are in their 20s. So I'm just curious that if you see a generational or a societal difference in how women are coming into themselves today versus when we were going through it.
That's a good question. I'd like to always be hopeful. This generation of women has more agency, and awareness in general. But I do think that, we're not going to get political here, but I do think that there are, forces that make it hard. And I do think also the social media, and that comparison and just that information sometimes makes it more difficult than when we were growing up. So if you think that, when we were growing up, we maybe had some external conditioning, they might have that even more so because of all of the information and kind of different messages out there that are kind of, um, getting their attention. So they might need more help in navigating like what volumes to turn down and what to turn up.
That's great. Karen calls it the compare and despair culture, social media,
Yes,
where, yeah, it's like, is her life perfect? And how does my non perfect life hold up to her perfect life? But we all know intellectually that it's not a perfect life because the circumstances behind the scenes. But on the surface, it's all perfect. The idea of trying to be perfect, it makes me really nervous for them and for us, because I think that's a non-attainable thing. And so if you're telling yourself that it can happen, it's even more harmful to self.
absolutely, absolutely. I think social media has and all those messages. There's good and bad to it, right? Of course, to most everything, but there's that compare and despair for sure, and this ideal of perfection. At the same time, I also think there's more models of what's possible out there than there were before. So that I think is can be hopeful too. I think there's maybe more images. There can be, if you pay attention, of different ways of being than there has been that we were exposed to maybe in the past. So
What do you mean? Like, give me an example of what you mean, like different ways to be. I think I know where you're going, but this idea that there's more role models for them to select from, is that where you're going?
I do think that there's more role models. I think there's more role models. I think there's more, we talked a lot about career pathing. I think there's more exposure to different career paths than there ever has been. If you pay attention to I do think that I'm hopeful that there's more ways for women to be independently financially. And I think that is available to them in ways that it hasn't been in the past. So there are some good things I think that we didn't have maybe growing up.
Yeah, legitimate. I think that's very legitimate. If you were talking to the Jen Faraday that is now, that would be 30, and you're able to whisper in her ear today, what were you saying to her?
So these questions I always think are interesting because I never regret anything. So I wouldn't change her journey because otherwise that would change me where I am now, right? So I guess it's, when we start off talk, you mentioned that I was like a lifelong learner. So this kind of circles back to that. There's always a lesson. There's always a lesson no matter where you are. So you might not know what that is at the time. So the Jen of 30, you might not know why you're here and why you feel stuck, but it will reveal itself if you just are open to it. I just right before I was looking through some old notes, and I came across. Do you know who Mary Oliver is? She's a poet, and one of her poems called "Sometimes." There's a section that says, "Instructions for life. Pay attention. be astonished, tell about it. And I just love that. And I think, so maybe that's what I would tell Jen of 30 is, pay attention. There's always those lessons in there. Be astonished, be surprised, because you don't know what's going to happen next, and stay open to it. And then make sure you tell about it, whether that's something as public as this podcast or telling yourself about it.
It's pretty cool. Yeah, I think you did mention her before. I'd have to look her up. I might have seen something in a blog that was made reference to her. Well, I have to say, I would just, and if I may, if I were to talking to the 30-year-old Monique, I would just tell her to chill the fuck out. Don't regret anything because everything makes you who you are. And if I'm like the happiest I've ever been in my life, which I am, then I can't remove any of those experiences. But I had to have had faith that it was all going to be okay. That all of those bumps in the road, I wasn't aware of why. I don't know why. I don't know how, but it was going to work out. That leap of faith is part of like what you tell yourself. And right in the moment, you're raising kids, you're managing the house, you're dealing with all these other external factors. You don't know that it's going to be all right.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And while we neither of us have regrets, going back again to the chapter of the book, just lending yourself more grace in those moments. So you're not regretting any decisions, but just maybe give yourself grace instead of, if you are kind of talking to yourself in a different way that's maybe negative, instead lend yourself some grace in that. Because even though, again, I wouldn't change my journey, I might have changed the way I spoke to myself in some of those moments to be less critical and just more open and compassionate.
I do mention that in the book as well. And that is the things that we say to ourselves, we would never in a million years think about saying to another human.
Exactly. So when you say, how do you parent your daughters, I would never parent them by the way I parented myself. The way I talked to myself at some of those times when I was 30, I would never say that to my daughter at 30. So that would be important, I think.
This has been so interesting. I think we could talk for hours. The idea, well, there's so many takeaways. I want to make sure I didn't miss any of them, honestly. The path that you're given or that you grow up with is not necessarily the path that you have to stay with. The career pivot is sometimes a great thing. You just have to maybe be with it and explore it and not judge it. Having fun. At one point you said, I wasn't having fun. The sweater didn't fit. All those analogies, all of those moments, those micro moments that I talk about are clues for the person to receive and process and maybe do something with. Not judgy, but allowing that thought to happen and then maybe what can I see for myself in this situation? I don't like the sweater. It doesn't fit me, but does it fit the moment? Is it solving for something? Like maybe you hate your job, but you need the benefits because you have a sick child or you have a child with disabilities or something. That serves you. So if you talk to yourself and this job allows for me to take care of Junior, you have a different lens on that job, I think, right?
Yeah, and to go to the sweater analogy, I was talking to myself in a way that was almost beating myself up for putting on the sweater. You know what I mean? Instead of saying, "Oh, it's so curious that I put the sweater on. Why did I put it on?" Or to go to the specific examples, this particular role is not a fit for me. I was instead beating myself up for that choice and feeling like I had to stay there. And there's some, instead of saying, that's interesting that I chose this. Now what? What can I learn from this? What do I want to keep the sweater on? Do I want to keep this role, stay in this role? So you can end up still making the same choices. But again, it's going back, it's how you talk to yourself. And do you need that beating yourself up part? I think you can skip that part.
Well said. Let's skip that part Completely accept that part. No, that's a good point. Yes. You know when something is off, but you don't necessarily need to beat yourself up for it. And like the GPS on a car, you may not know where you're going, but you know where you are. I thought that was such a great quote. I think you should copyright that. I think you really should. And then there's always a lesson in the things that happen, and the idea that you need to give yourself grace and allow for mistakes and know that it's going to be okay, whatever that okay is. And certainly we'll leave you with speak to yourself as you would your daughter or your best friend. That was awesome. Thank you so much, Jen Faraday. Mwah.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great. I'm so excited um, for hearing the other stories that you have through your interviews and also in the book. I think it'll really serve so many people. So thank you.
I hope so. I hope so. So thank you so much. Guys, hope you've enjoyed this. I'm going to put some show notes down below and how to reach Jen if you want to reach out to her. She's an amazing, amazing coach as well. So, in addition to being all of the other things that she is, and that's what makes that beautiful combination sandwich that we have right here. It's a beautiful thing. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Possibilities with Monique DeMeo. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for listening to Possibilities with Monique DeMeo, where we unpack life as a female mover and shaker. If you like the show, please consider liking it, or better still, subscribing to it and leaving us a rating. It truly does help. Also, you can pick up my book, The 7 Secrets to Creating a Life You Love, a practical guide for women in leadership. You can find the book, other episodes of this podcast, and how to stay in touch at MoniqueDeMeo.com. DEMAIO. I look forward to seeing you again soon. With gratitude, Monique.